In 380 BCE, one man wrote something so dangerous about women's power that Western civilization spent 2 millennia trying to bury it. Plato's Republic didn't just suggest women could lead, it argued they were naturally designed to philosophically govern. And the reason this terrifies modern relationship dynamics? Because if you truly understood what he meant, you'd never tolerate being anyone's second choice again. Think about that for a moment. While Athens wouldn't let women own property, vote, or even speak in public assemblies, Plato, born into one of the city's most aristocratic families, descended from kings and the great lawmaker Solon himself, was designing a society where women would make the laws. This wasn't some progressive philosopher trying to be nice. This was a man who witnessed political chaos, who studied under Socrates and saw the absolute mess men made when given unchecked power. He looked at the ruins of Athenian democracy and asked a question no one else dared to ask. What if we've been ignoring half of humanity's intellectual capacity? In Book 5 of the Republic, Plato laid out something so specific it couldn't be dismissed as metaphor. He argued that women should serve as guardians, the philosopher-rulers of the ideal state, not as advisors, not as supporters, as the actual governing class, receiving the same education as men, training in the same disciplines, making the same decisions. He called this the first wave of his radical reforms, and even his own dialogue participants were shocked. But Plato didn't back down. He argued that the only real difference between men and women was biological reproduction, and that had nothing to do with the capacity for wisdom, courage, or philosophical reasoning. Now here's what makes this absolutely devastating to modern relationship dynamics. Plato understood something about feminine intellectual sovereignty that our culture has systematically trained you to forget. He recognized that women possess what he called thumos, that spirited, fierce element of the soul that refuses to accept injustice. The same quality that makes you a natural philosopher is the same quality that makes you refuse to settle. And for 2,000 years, Western civilization worked overtime to convince you that this quality was unfeminine, aggressive, or unattractive. If you've ever felt smarter than the man making all the decisions in your relationship, if you've ever had to dumb yourself down to avoid threatening his ego, if you've ever been told you think too much or analyze too deeply, you're experiencing the cultural suppression of exactly what Plato celebrated. The philosopher-queen isn't a metaphor, it's your operational blueprint. It's the intellectual authority you were born with before society taught you to apologize for it. But before we unlock what Plato actually discovered about feminine authority, you need to understand why most women today are operating from a position of philosophical poverty and how this keeps you trapped in relationships where you're constantly negotiating for basic respect. Here's what no one tells you about modern relationship advice. It's all designed to make you a better responder to his reality, never the creator of your own. And this isn't accidental. It's the exact opposite of what Plato understood about female rational authority. Look at the language everywhere. How to communicate your needs more effectively. How to set boundaries without pushing him away. How to express your concerns so he'll actually listen. Notice the pattern? You're being taught to translate your legitimate philosophical insights into a format that won't threaten his sense of control. You're not learning to govern, you're learning to negotiate for the basic recognition that you already possess rational authority. And every single time you do this, you're betraying the part of yourself that knows better. You know exactly what I'm talking about. That moment when you see a pattern in your relationship. Maybe he dismisses your observations. Maybe he makes unilateral decisions about your shared life. Maybe he requires 3 layers of emotional cushioning before he'll consider your perspective valid. And you can predict exactly how it will play out. You're right. You know you're right. You've watched this scenario unfold 17 times before. But instead of simply acting from your knowledge, you find yourself building a case, gathering evidence, softening your delivery, choosing the perfect moment, explaining why your boundary is reasonable, justifying why your standard isn't too high, managing his reaction to your basic requirement for respect. This is what Plato would call living in the cave. You've seen the truth, you have direct knowledge, what he termed episteme, but you're being forced to argue about the shadows on the wall. And the most insidious part? Modern culture has convinced you this is empowerment. You're told that articulating your needs is strength, that clear communication is maturity, that patient explanation is wisdom. But answer this honestly. When does he have to build a philosophical case for his perspective? When does he gather evidence to justify his reality? When does he carefully calibrate his words to avoid threatening your ego? He doesn't, because he's been granted something you haven't, assumed authority. His thoughts are treated as rational by default. Yours require a defense. The exhaustion you feel isn't from loving hard or caring deeply. It's from the constant cognitive labor of governing your own life while performing deference to someone else's intellectual authority. You're doing the philosophical work of a ruler while accepting the status of an advisor who needs permission to speak. Every boundary you explain is a law you should simply decree. Every standard you justify is a principle you should simply embody. Every time you say, "I feel like," instead of "I know," you're genuflecting to a system that Plato dismantled 24 centuries ago. And here's the cruelest irony. You're living in a culture with infinitely more legal rights than Plato's Athens, where women couldn't own property, inherit wealth, or participate in civic life, yet you have less philosophical recognition. Ancient Athens legally subordinated women, while Plato philosophically elevated them to guardian status. Modern culture legally freed women while philosophically conditioning you to doubt your own rational authority. You've gained the vote, but lost the throne. Think about the intellectual loneliness of your daily experience. You see patterns your partner dismisses as overthinking. You predict outcomes he calls pessimistic until they happen exactly as you described. You identify problems he labels as you being dramatic. Then 3 months later, he presents your exact solution as his revelation. You're not overthinking the relationship. You're out-philosophizing someone who refuses to think at all. And the most dangerous gaslighting isn't him questioning your reality. It's you questioning whether your superior analysis makes you difficult. Plato called this doxa versus episteme, the difference between opinion and knowledge. When you defer to his opinion despite your knowledge, when you treat his unexamined assumptions as equally valid as your carefully reasoned conclusions, when you accept "let's agree to disagree" about observable facts, you're not being diplomatic. You're philosophically impoverishing yourself to maintain his comfort. You're a philosopher-queen pretending to be a subject so he can pretend to be a king. Modern empowerment content tells you to find your voice, but Plato understood you never lost your voice. You lost recognition of your authority to govern from it. The question isn't whether you can speak, it's whether you're willing to stop explaining why your laws are reasonable and simply enforce them as the rational authority you are. Now, you might be thinking this sounds idealistic. Ancient philosophy can't fix modern dating chaos. But that's exactly the conditioned response Plato predicted would keep women enslaved. Let me show you what he actually said about female nature versus female conditioning. Let's be crystal clear about what Plato actually argued, because this isn't feminist revisionism, it's textual fact from the mouth of Western philosophy's founding father. And when you understand his logical proof for female authority, you'll never accept intellectual subordination again. In Book 5 of the Republic, specifically sections 451c through 457b, Plato presents something radical that most philosophy courses conveniently skip over. Through his character, Socrates, he systematically dismantles every objection to female guardians using pure logical necessity, not emotional appeals, not fairness arguments, not progressive politics that wouldn't exist for 2 millennia. Cold, rational proof that the ideal state requires female philosophical governance. His logic moves in 3 devastating steps. First, nature. He argues that men and women differ only in reproductive function. One bears children, one begets them. That's it. Everything else you've been told about fundamental differences in rational capacity, courage, or wisdom, cultural fabrication. Second, education. If nature provides the same intellectual equipment, then women require the same rigorous training as male guardians: philosophy, mathematics, physical discipline, dialectical reasoning. Third, role. If nature and education are equivalent, then women must serve in the same governing positions. To do otherwise isn't traditional, it's logically incoherent. It's wasting half your state's rational resources. Now here's where this becomes personally devastating to your current relationship dynamics. Plato describes the tripartite soul, 3 elements that exist in every human being: reason, which should govern; spirit, which protects and enforces; appetite, which seeks satisfaction. He argues that in the ideal person, reason rules, spirit defends reason's judgments, and appetite submits to both. The philosopher guardian is someone whose soul has achieved this natural hierarchy. Does that structure sound familiar? Because you already live it internally. Your reason analyzes patterns, identifies problems, generates solutions. Your spirit refuses to accept disrespect, injustice, or intellectual dismissal. Your appetite seeks connection, pleasure, security. But here's what Plato understood that your relationship doesn't acknowledge. This internal governance structure isn't something you need to develop. It's your natural state. You're already philosophically governing yourself. The problem is you're being required to pretend someone else is in charge. When Plato's dialogue partner Glaucon objects to female guardians, using arguments about women being weaker, different, naturally domestic, Plato doesn't concede an inch. He uses the Socratic method to reveal that every objection confuses cultural conditioning with nature. Yes, women are generally physically smaller, irrelevant to rational governance. Yes, women bear children, irrelevant to philosophical capacity. Yes, Athenian society restricts women to domestic roles, irrelevant to what women are capable of by nature. Think about the audacity of this moment. Plato is writing in a society where women couldn't own property, couldn't speak in public assemblies, couldn't inherit wealth independently, were essentially transferred from father's control to husband's control. This wasn't theoretical oppression. This was his daily reality. And in that environment, he looks at the absolute mess Athenian men made of democracy and concludes, "We've been ignoring half of humanity's rational capacity, and it's philosophically indefensible." He identifies what he calls arete, or excellence or virtue, as fulfilling your nature's highest potential. For a guardian, that means exercising wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance in governance. Not learning these qualities, revealing them. They're already in you, suppressed by a culture that benefits from your silence. The philosopher-queen isn't an aspiration. It's your default state before cultural conditioning convinced you to perform intellectual deference. You now possess something 98% of people with philosophy degrees don't understand: the logical foundation for your own rational authority, validated by Western philosophy's foundational text. 24 centuries of intellectual weight stands behind you. So if Plato's logic is irrefutable, and it is, why don't you feel like a philosopher-queen in your actual life? Because there's a specific gap between philosophical truth and embodied reality, and closing that gap is exactly what Section 4 reveals. The philosopher-queen doesn't negotiate her authority. She embodies it through 4 governing principles Plato embedded in his Republic. These aren't strategies to get him to behave, they're sovereignty practices that make his behavior irrelevant to your internal kingdom. Let me be absolutely clear about what we're doing here. This isn't about fixing your relationship. This isn't about communicating better, or loving smarter, or setting boundaries more effectively. Those frameworks still position you as someone seeking permission to govern yourself. What I'm giving you are the 4 pillars of Platonic feminine authority. The actual philosophical architecture that transforms you from someone negotiating for respect into someone embodying rational sovereignty. Each pillar draws directly from Plato's Republic, translated into modern relationship application. And once these are anchored in your psyche, his behavior becomes irrelevant to your internal kingdom. The first pillar, rational self-governance. Plato argued that the philosopher-ruler governs through reason, not reaction. The rational element of the soul, the logistikon, must rule over spirit and appetite. Not suppress them, not ignore them, rule them. This means your decisions flow from your rational center, regardless of the emotional weather around you. In modern relationships, this transforms everything. When he's in a mood, withdrawn, irritable, passive-aggressive, most women immediately begin emotional management. You analyze what you might have done wrong, you adjust your behavior to improve his state, you take responsibility for atmospheric conditions you didn't create. That's not partnership. That's allowing someone else's emotional chaos to govern your choices. Rational self-governance means your internal state remains under your command regardless of his. If he's moody, you govern your response. You might choose engagement. I notice you're withdrawn. I'm available if you want to talk. You might choose distance, continuing your plans without absorbing his energy. You might choose observation, noting this pattern for future assessment. But the choice comes from your reason, not from reactive accommodation to his emotional climate. The psychological mechanism here is crucial. You're shifting your locus of control from external validation to internal authority. His mood is data, not direction. His opinion is information, not legislation. You process it through your rational faculty and decide what governance looks like in this moment. The daily practice: run a philosophical audit on your decisions. Ask yourself, did I choose this from my rational center, or was I reacting to manage someone else's emotions? If you canceled plans because he seemed disappointed, you reacted. If you evaluated his disappointment, considered your priorities, and chose to stay or go from reason, you governed. The distinction is everything. The second pillar, dialectical boundaries. Plato's Socratic method reveals truth through questioning, not through assertion. This is brilliant for modern relationship dynamics because questions grant authority while explanations surrender it. When you explain why your boundary is reasonable, you've already accepted the position of defendant. When you question the logic challenging your boundary, you maintain the position of judge. Here's the practical translation. Instead of, "You're gaslighting me about what I said last week," you ask, "Help me understand why you remember that conversation so differently than I do. Walk me through your recollection." Instead of defending your standard, "I need someone who prioritizes our relationship." You question his framework. What does prioritization look like in a committed partnership? Instead of asserting, "Your tone is disrespectful," you inquire, "Do you notice how your voice changes when you disagree with me? What do you think that communicates?" The psychological mechanism is you're forcing accountability through self-examination, rather than triggering defensive argumentation. When you assert, he defends. When you question, he has to prove his own logic. And most manipulative behavior cannot withstand Socratic scrutiny because it relies on you accepting flawed premises without examination. This is dialectical boundary setting. Your boundaries don't need explanation, they need his justification for why they shouldn't exist. Why do you think I'm responsible for managing your anger? Is a boundary disguised as curiosity. What makes you believe your discomfort with my success is something I should accommodate? Is a wall that looks like a question. You're not arguing, you're making him confront the philosophical poverty of his position. The power dynamic shift is profound. He can't dismiss a question the way he dismisses a statement. You're too sensitive, shuts down, that hurt me. But what makes my response to disrespect seem like oversensitivity rather than appropriate self-regard? Forces him into philosophical territory where his position collapses. Questions make him prove his claim. Statements make you prove yours. The third pillar, form-based standards. In Plato's theory of forms, the ideal exists independently of flawed material manifestations. The form of justice doesn't change because unjust societies exist. The form of beauty doesn't adjust because ugly things exist. The form exists first, and everything else is measured against it, not the other way around. Apply this to your relationship standards. The form of partnership, mutual respect, intellectual companionship, emotional reciprocity, shared growth, exists because it's true, not because he meets it. Your standards aren't aspirational wishes you're hoping someone fulfills. They're philosophical realities you're assessing alignment with. This completely transforms relationship dynamics. You're not negotiating with shadows in the cave wall, trying to convince yourself that this lesser version is close enough to what you know you need. You're observing the gap between the form and the manifestation without needing to close it through self-betrayal. Does this relationship reflect the ideal? Simple assessment. No justification required. No explanation needed. You're observing the gap without needing to close it. If there's misalignment between the form and the relationship, that's information. You don't contort yourself to manufacture alignment. You don't lower your standards to match his effort. You simply acknowledge, this relationship exists in the cave. The form exists in the light. These are not the same. What you do with that information is your sovereign choice, but you stop lying to yourself about the gap. The fourth pillar, philosophical detachment. Plato's philosopher exists partially outside the cave, able to observe the shadows while knowing they're not reality. This is your most powerful position, maintaining witness consciousness during relationship dynamics. You can be in the argument while simultaneously observing the pattern. You can feel the emotion while watching yourself feel it. Modern application, you're sitting across from him during a conflict and part of you is engaged, responding, feeling, processing. But part of you has ascended to what I call the observer's throne. From there, you're watching the entire theater. This is the third time this month he's used tone to shut down my concern without addressing content. Interesting pattern. You're not dissociating, you're achieving meta-awareness. The psychological mechanism is what Viktor Frankl described as the space between stimulus and response, the freedom that makes you human. He says something dismissive. That's stimulus. Your hurt feelings arise. That's natural. But before you respond, there's space. And from the observer's throne, you're watching all of it. He's attempting to make his discomfort with accountability into my problem by attacking my delivery. My spirit wants to defend. My appetite wants to placate to restore peace. What does my reason say? The practice developed the mental muscle to occupy the observer's throne even during emotional intensity. Notice when you're being invited into his chaos versus ruling from your clarity. He escalates. You observe. He's escalating to avoid the actual issue. He withdraws. You note. Withdrawal is punishment. Classic pattern. You're experiencing the relationship while simultaneously governing from outside it. This is how philosopher-queens maintain sovereignty in any dynamic. You're never fully inside someone else's emotional storm. Part of you always remains on the throne, watching, assessing, governing. His manipulation tactics hit air because you're not where he thinks you are. You're not reacting from the arena, you're observing from above it and choosing, from reason, if and how to engage. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds empowering philosophically, but how do I actually live this starting tomorrow? That's exactly what Section 5 translates, but you need these 4 pillars anchored in your psyche.
Philosophical understanding without practice is like knowing you're a queen but still scrubbing the floors. It's time to actually ascend the throne. Here's your 7-day protocol to embody everything Plato knew you already were. This isn't theory anymore. For the next 7 days, you're going to anchor these 4 pillars into lived experience through specific daily practices. Start exactly where you are. Don't wait for the perfect relationship moment or the ideal emotional state. Plato understood that virtue develops through habituation, repeated action until rational authority becomes your default operating system. Day 1 and 2 focus on rational self-governance. Each day, make one significant decision from pure reason rather than reactive emotion or conditioned accommodation. Not every decision, just one. Maybe it's keeping plans when he's sulking instead of canceling to manage his mood. Maybe it's stating your observation without softening it to protect his ego. Whatever it is, choose from your rational center and journal the difference. How does it feel in your body? What's his response? Most importantly, do you feel more solid in your own authority? Day 3 and 4 introduce dialectical boundaries in real time. Convert 3 statements into Socratic questions and observe what happens. Instead of, "You never prioritize our time together," ask, "What does prioritizing partnership look like to you?" Instead of explaining why his tone is disrespectful, inquire, "Do you hear how your voice changes when I disagree with you?" You're not trying to win arguments. You're conducting a philosophical seminar where he has to examine his own logic. His confusion isn't your problem to soothe. You're the teacher. He's discovering whether he can think. Day 5 is your form-based standards audit. Take 30 minutes alone and list the gaps between your relationship's current reality and the form of partnership you know exists. Write it without judgment, without solutions, without justifying why you've accepted the shadows. Just observe the distance between the ideal and the manifestation. This isn't about deciding what to do, it's about ending the lies you tell yourself about alignment. Day 6, you practice philosophical detachment during one conflict or tense moment. Feel everything fully, but maintain part of your consciousness on the observer's throne. Watch yourself having the experience. Notice his patterns. Observe your own impulses before you act on them. Create that space between stimulus and response where your freedom lives. Day 7 is integration. For 24 hours, govern from all 4 pillars simultaneously. You're rational, dialectical, form-aligned, and philosophically detached all at once. This is philosopher-queen embodiment. It will feel foreign at first, like speaking a language you studied but never used conversationally. That's expected. Plato knew that courage, Andrea, is required to live according to truth rather than cultural conditioning. Now, here's what women report after these 7 days, and it's always one of 2 outcomes. Either he rises to meet you, suddenly capable of depth you didn't know he had, responding to your sovereignty with his own growth, or he reveals fundamental incompatibility, Both are victories. One gives you the partnership that matches the form, the other gives you clarity that frees you to find it. The philosopher-queen wins either way. The guilt you might feel? Plato would call that false appetite, cultural conditioning mistaking self-betrayal for virtue. The pushback he might give? That's evidence you were governing his comfort instead of your reality. The loneliness you fear? The philosopher is always initially alone. The cave allegory predicts this. You see the light before others do. These 7 days will either transform your relationship or clarify it needs to end. Both outcomes are victories for a philosopher-queen. And if you want a community of women walking this path with you, making this transition infinitely easier,
here's the truth Plato understood about philosopher-queens. They need a council, not an audience. One woman practicing sovereignty is radical. A collective is unstoppable. The Philosopher-Queens Collective is where Plato's Republic meets modern relationship mastery. This isn't another female empowerment space filled with surface-level affirmations. We study ancient wisdom, not modern trends. We practice dialectical accountability, not echo chamber validation. These are women who refuse to govern from their knees, intellectual equals who understand exactly what you're building. Plato founded the Academy because he knew philosophical transformation requires community. You can't sustain sovereignty against 2 millennia of cultural conditioning alone. You need women who speak this language, who've walked the 7 days, who understand the cost and glory of rational authority. Spaces are limited because the conversation requires a certain caliber. Click the link below or comment Queen for access. Your counsel is waiting. The question is whether you're ready to stop practicing philosophy alone and start governing alongside women who see what you see.